Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I hope that you are all doing well. Today, I am joined by a mutual of mine, a mutual friend, and a man whose talents are truly a God given gift. I'm joined today by Mr. Shayne Swenson. How are you, sir?
Good, how are you? It's nice to finally chat with you like this.
Yeah, it is. It's good rather than just Twitter DMs or commenting
hmm
back and forth on Twitter. It's always nice. I was telling my friends at church I was going to do this, and I said, the best part of doing a podcast is that you just get to talk to your friends for a couple
Yeah,
hours every week. It's the best part about doing this sort of thing. And you do it for
absolutely.
yourself to some point where you kind of get selfish about it. Like I'll review TV shows and I don't care if you don't like it. It's for me and my friends to talk.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, uh, I guess really the word to get started is just, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and how you've come to where you are today?
Um, okay, well, I'll try and be as succinct as possible. Well, I'm a Orthodox iconographer, and I'm assuming most of the people that listen to your podcast know what that is, but I'll explain what that is briefly. An Orthodox iconographer is someone who paints icons for the Orthodox Church. Iconography is a foundation, one of the foundations of what we believe as Orthodox Christians about God and about reality. I won't go into the theology of it, but I'll just say that it's a very important part of Orthodox Christianity. And my job as an artist is to take the art skills that I have, that I've cultivated and been blessed with, I guess you could say, or whatever, and to be a good steward with that, and to focus that on creating iconography for the church. And so I don't really think there's too many people that don't know, at least probably that watch or listen to your podcast. Most everybody knows what iconography is. So I'll just leave it at that. If you're interested in learning more about it, you can Google it. But yeah, that's what I do. I also spent 20 years as a tattoo artist and an artist in other capacities. So I have a background as an art professional, I guess you could say, and that was sort of my segue into iconography. So
Yeah, I was about to say, did you go to any sort of professional artistic training or classes, or was this just sort of a talent you had as a kid, and then it sort of led to your tattoo artistry and other work?
well, yeah, I mean, I always had an interest in art as a kid. I was the kid who would never do his homework and would just draw on his stuff. Because I was just maybe mildly autistic or something. I don't know. I was really into comic books. I grew up in the 90s. And so during the 1990s, comic books that was like a second golden age of comic books. If anybody's listening was into comic books at that time, I used to get Wizard magazine, which was like this monthly magazine that would come out that had all of these different like summaries of whatever the hot comics were at the time or whatever. And I was really into Spawn. That was like a really big 90s comic. And so I spent a lot of time interested in comic books and drawing comic books. And then as the 90s closed out, comic books sort of, the comic industry, I guess you could say, um, yeah, it kind of took a dive. It just wasn't really a realistic career path, I guess. Similar, I guess, to how people would think, oh, I'm really into video games, so I'm going to be a game designer. It's like, well, I'm sure you could probably do that, but right out of high school, I don't really think that that's, most people that try and pursue that, they don't inevitably get to work on some huge video game and make a ton of money. So, yeah, comic books just really weren't going to be my the way that I made a living. And so when I turned 18, I mean, I still was into drawing or whatever, but I joined the U.S. military, and I was in the Army for 4 years, technically 5 years because I did a year in the National Guard. They had this program where once you do 4 years active, it was called the Try One, which I don't know if they do it anymore because I don't really know too many people who do it and then sign up for the remainder of the time. You do your 4 years and then you ETS. It's when you get out of the military, you get out of active
Yeah.
duty, you go into a guard unit, wherever you're going to go to school or wherever you go home to, you go to your guard unit and you do a year and you do drill and all that. And then if you like it, you can extend to do the remainder of your 6 year, 8 year commitment or whatever. Well, going from active duty to National Guard. Anybody who's prior service military listening to this, like the huge difference between active duty and National Guard, especially before. I mean, this was post 9/11, but it was in between 9/11 and Iraq, so it was kind of right in between those two wars that were going on. And so anyway, I I finally separated fully from the military, and didn't really know what I wanted to do, and bummed around a little bit, played in a band, did all that fun stuff you get to do when you don't have any responsibility in your early 20s. And I met my wife, and I sort of fell into tattooing. I was getting tattooed a lot. A friend of mine, this was like 2002, 2003. Yeah, well, 2003, I guess. Getting tattooed a lot, and I was like, I'm an all right artist. I'm better than this dude. So I talked to him, and I kind of, one thing led to another, and I got my foot in the door. And back then, the tattoo industry, like now, it's easy to do. Like you can become anybody can become a tattoo artist now. There's videos online, and you can buy a machine and get your license if your state requires that, and figure it out in just a year or two. Like it is exponentially way easier to become a qualified high skill tattoo artist now than it was 20 years ago. But back then it was almost like a secret society in a way. You had to know someone, you really had to get your foot in the door, and wherever you were the apprentice at, that's how it works basically. Like there weren't these tattoo schools like there exists now. And frankly, even now, if you go to a tattoo school and go into any reputable tattoo shop, they'll probably laugh at you. And that's not really a cool way to learn how to tattoo, even to this day. But anyway, I got an apprenticeship, did that, and just started tattooing. Did that for a number of years, and then when I converted to Orthodoxy, then I pretty quickly jumped into iconography. That wasn't really what drew me to Orthodoxy. A lot of people assume that it's the iconography, and that was sort of like this tertiary interest, but it wasn't the main thing that drew me to Orthodox Christianity.
Well, I guess that's the perfect segue to the next question. Then, this was what did draw you in? Because obviously you're older than I am. I presume that your conversion was, definitely before this sort of internet, the fandomification of religion, to where, it's more of a hat people put on, like a cheese head for the Green Bay Packers, which is really unfortunate. But and in the same way, like Rod Dreher converted in 2006, long before any sort of internet fandom for it. So if you mind telling us how you got into the church.
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up in a Catholic family, but we were sort of in between devout and nominally Catholic. So we went to mass. My mom was super taken by sort of that charismatic Catholicism in the 80s and 90s. That was like a really big thing. And so I had gone to Catholic school for several years, and I wouldn't say that I was catechized, being a kid, like you don't really care about that stuff, but being exposed to it and being just within that Catholic ethos, for lack of a better term, it was familiar to me. At least that form of Vatican II. I hate even saying that. That sounds so dumb, like Vatican II, but you know what I mean? It was like really the pinnacle of that kind of Catholicism that a lot of people reject now. My experience with it wasn't bad. Like I was never like taken advantage of by a priest. Like that didn't enter my mind, or our community at all. It was actually a pretty healthy Catholic community. And so met some great people, went to Catholic school for 4 or 5 years. And inevitably, when I was, 12, 13, I stopped going to Catholic school and started going to private school. And my mom and my dad, she was married at the time to my stepdad. They're not married now, but they were at the time. We had a relatively stable family home life. They just stopped going to mass. And I don't know what happened, but we just stopped going to Catholic church, and we just stopped going to church altogether. And so, I didn't really care. Cool. I don't have to go to church anymore. I don't have to go to church when I go to school. Wow, that's cool, you know? And so I go along through a couple years of public school. I end up in high school and was having a little bit of a rough go in high school because I wouldn't say that I didn't fit in. I mean, I had friends and stuff, but it was the 90s and I was into like skateboarding and Nine Inch Nails and, you know, I grew up in Montana. And so I grew up in Missoula, Montana. So it wasn't like it was a small town, but a lot of people say Missoula is sort of like the Berkeley of Montana, which I think is a little bit of a stretch, but it's known to be more of the I guess it's a college town. Let's put it that
Yeah.
way. So so it wasn't like terrible, you know. I wasn't like chased by hillbillies or something for being an outsider or anything like that. But I had difficulty fitting in with the. I was the nerdy guy listening to Nine Inch Nails and riding a skateboard and drawing comic books. And anyway, I met this guy in one of my classes, and he invited me to hang out after school, and so we did. And by hanging out, I thought it was just go hang out at his house. I mean, we got along, like he had a great sense of humor. We became instant friends. But he was not like me. He wasn't, you know, didn't have the same interests. But I'm sure everyone that's listening to this has made friends that are like, why are we friends? Like, you're into this, I'm into this, but for some reason we're just friends. We get along. And so I ended up going over to his house, and he actually was like, well, we're going to go to this thing called a youth group. So I ended up going to his youth group with him, and it was this like crazy Pentecostal, like speaking in tongues, holy roller stuff, which I sort of understood a little bit because of my mom's charismatic Catholic thing. So it didn't freak me out, and I met some really cool people. And the school year goes by, I end up start hanging out with those people more, and I go to the classic Jesus summer camp, and I believe I was like 14, maybe 13. I didn't really understand the Christianity thing. Like, I understood it, what they were talking about Jesus and stuff, but I didn't. There wasn't an emotional connection.
Yeah.
And there wasn't really. The only reason I was going is because there were girls and my friend, and it was just a social thing. Well, at this Christian youth camp, youth group camp, I had what you would call a born again experience. Now, I don't know if it's. I don't really try to define that because it was a different time in my life and I was a different person, and so I don't. You know, some people who convert to Orthodoxy, they throw everything out from their
Yeah.
past, from their, you know, and I don't think that that's healthy, and I don't think it's necessary. And if it wasn't for that experience, I probably wouldn't be Orthodox today. So what do they say? You know, that we know where the Holy Spirit is, but we don't know where the Holy Spirit isn't operating. Oh, that's always, people always say the church, but it's actually Bishop Ware actually said the Holy Spirit, not the church. So
Yeah.
I don't make judgments on that stuff, and I don't judge other people for where they're at. So anyway, I had this experience, and I really felt like it was like I met Christ or whatever. And it profoundly changed me and impacted me and how I saw the world. And I was a Christian from that point on. And I was, you know, just sort of a Foursquare, Calvary Chapel, sort of like Pentecostal evangelical without really saying, "Oh, I'm a Pentecostal." I don't know if
Yeah.
that makes sense. Sort of a spirit-filled evangelical, non-denominational kind of thing. And I did that up through high school, and then as I said earlier, I joined the military. And if any of you know how it is in the military, if you're a Christian, it's real hard to be a Christian when you're in the military,
Yeah.
and
Sure.
especially if you're stationed in Europe, because the drinking age is 18, not 21, and it's just tough to maintain that. There were no churches where I was at besides the on post.
And those are the worst. Like growing up, that's what I had, and your choices were sort of a non-denominational Baptist service, or you had the Catholic Mass. And what it was, I
Yeah,
tell people this all the time. Like, if you grew up with it, you understand that there's no real Christianity there with like the chaplain corps. Not to say that there aren't believers or to throw down what those men do in the military. It's just that you're on post. It's it's a Sunday culture social club where the wives, kind of like the officers' wives, will harangue you. It's like, well, we didn't see you there last Sunday, and it's just like And then they'll have like their sunrise Easter service, and it's all these, men in their dress blues, and they'll tell you that he is risen, but they don't tell you why that's important, or
Right.
who he even is, because they're almost afraid to say Jesus in these sort of services, which is so growing up with that, it turned me off from ever going to church at all. And so yeah,
Yeah.
anyone who's in the military, and if you grew up in Europe, yeah, it's really hard to be a Christian.
Yeah, it's sparse on post in America, but like you said, in Europe, they're very, nobody goes. I don't want to say nobody, but a lot of people don't go to church anyway. Even back then, over 20 years ago, but they try to like just sequester all of it into this, like, well, you're all sort of not Catholic, so you can all just kind of do church like that. Yeah, you're totally right. And so I had no interest in that, and I drifted anyway by that time, and um, yeah, just sort of, I didn't intentionally walk away from it. It's just, things happen like that in your life, especially as a young person. And I drifted, and yeah, it was my salad days, as they say, and had fun, and wasn't really concerned with God or Christianity. And so I'll spare all the details there. I ended up getting out of the military, and as I said earlier, I was, became a tattoo artist. And around that time, I met my wife. She's my girlfriend at the time, obviously, and she doesn't come from a Christian home at all, and so she's sort of like a blank slate. And so we started around this time. I'd been tattooing maybe like a year or two. We moved to Seattle, and in Seattle, there was this church that had just started going. It'd been going for a little while, but it just started getting kind of popular. And there were some tattooers that I knew in Seattle who went to this church, and the church is called Mars Hill. And the pastor was Pastor Mark Driscoll. And I know some people listening to this will know exactly who that is. He's still a pastor now. He's still actually a pretty well-known evangelical pastor now.
Sure
I,
is.
I say I say evangelical like this loosely because I think he might have some denominational affiliation now, because when I went to church there, he was buddying up with I think like Wayne Grudem. Some of the Acts 29 was sort of loosely reformed,
Hmm.
which I'm gonna now talk about. And so through Mark and my experience at Mars Hill, I reconnected with Christianity, but it was a more substantive Christianity. And he was also believed in the charismatic gifts, and so, but it was a lot more measured. But it was Mark Driscoll and his sermons, and we had these things called community groups because it was such a big church, where he wanted there to be legitimate community within Seattle, and so there were group leaders in the different areas or different neighborhoods. Seattle has these like famous neighborhoods, and there's like Capitol Hill and Ballard and all this. There's all these like neighborhoods. Every big city has that, but Seattle has these like really well-known areas. And so I went to my community group, which is my local community neighborhood, and then we'd all go to church at Mars Hill. And through there, I met other people who were very interested in church history, and I put an asterisk there because they were very interested in the Reformation, so that's kind of where it stopped. But that was my first introduction to history and the history of Christianity. And I learned about Calvin, and I was never really taken by Calvinism. I just sort of embraced it because that was what the brand of theology, the systematic theology that everyone around me said was legit. And so that's just what I leaned into. But I was never like a harsh 5-point Calvinist. I didn't really care, to be honest. I just liked the community in the church, and I liked Mark. And so he gave me an interest in, or an ability to value, Christian history. And so from there, we went there for a couple of years. And there was always drama there because in evangelical churches, Protestant churches in general. I mean, and this happens in every church, but because the buck doesn't really stop anywhere, even with mainline Protestant denominations. I'm saying this as an Orthodox Christian. I know some people will probably disagree, but as an Orthodox Christian, there is no legitimate God-given authority within those churches. I mean, there just isn't. There's no priesthood. There are no bishops. The buck doesn't really stop anywhere. And so you sort of get into this issue with authority. And a lot of the times, otherwise great men, good pastors, end up in questionable situations because of their ego and because they may have like a mentor, but it's just some other random dude who runs a church. And
Hmm.
no, even if they have these big like boards, like Acts 29 was this like accountability network, and but there wasn't real accountability at the end of the day because it just dissolved when the egos got too big and the personalities and the cult of personalities got too big. There's more to it, but that's part of the reason. So that all kind of started to happen. Mark went that direction, and so um, I split, and it was also in conjunction with a time where I was really starting to question the foundation of the brand of Christianity that I believe. Now, I didn't really have an understanding of. I just thought that's what Christianity was. Catholicism and Orthodoxy weren't even on my mind at this time. But I've always had a an amateur interest in philosophy. I won't say that I've read. I haven't studied philosophy from. I haven't done philosophy that way. I don't want to misrepresent like I'm some big brain philosophy nerd, but I always struggled with some of the answers that you get from the evangelical apologist crew, as far as like the basic stuff like the existence of God or the basic stuff, the problem of evil, all that stuff. I didn't really think that the answers I was getting from like Ravi Zacharias or William Lane Craig, as smart as those guys were, sex crimes aside, with Ravi Zacharias, I learned years later he was just like some creep, which really, anyway, it's a whole different conversation. But as brilliant as somebody like William Lane Craig is, I didn't feel like there was just something off about it. And so I remember having a bit of an existential crisis and rejecting Christianity, not intentionally. I just had this moment where I went, this doesn't seem like it's true. And if it's not true, I have no interest. Why am I doing this if it's not true? I don't know what I think about Christ, but I know that whatever this is just nonsense to me at this point. And so I had a little bit of a tough time because that's what my whole entire worldview was built upon, was Christianity for however old I was. And so, I had a rough go, let's just say, for a while. But inevitably, I settled into what I would call a reluctant atheism. I was past agnostic because of my personality type. I'm a cynic. Maybe it's because I'm like a Gen X millennial or whatever they are. Like I'm kind of on the edge, so I get a lot of that cynicism from the pop culture that I imbibed as a teenager. But whatever. I mean, that sounds really dumb, but you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
the prevailing whatever. It really had an effect. It can't not have an effect on you. And it had a profound effect on me because there wasn't really the internet. So it was, you were the whole, like I was super into grunge and all that stuff. That was sort of my era. And everybody from that era kind of has a similar outlook. You're very cynical, irony, irony. You talk about this. You and Gio talk
Yeah.
about this a lot. There's the irony thing, and like, yeah, and you guys are dead on. That's just sort of that's what that's just the vibe that most of us have from that generation. Love it or not. And so that's my natural setting. Is I'm a pessimist. I'm a cynic. Um, that's too good to be true. It's I'm probably just going to die and rot and be forgotten, and that's just been my natural setting. I still struggle with it to a great degree, but I have the tools to deal with it now, which at the time I didn't. So I jettisoned the Christianity thing and embraced a reluctant atheism, not an angry atheism. I didn't hate God. I was sort of bummed that he wasn't there, but I just moved on with my life and continued to smoke weed and just be a typical degenerate. Maybe not degenerate. I had kids and a family and stuff, but just a typical tattooer, go to work, tattoo, paint, just a normal guy, not really purposefully not really questioning deeper things and just coasting. And at the time I lived north of Seattle. I didn't even live in the city at that point. I lived north of Seattle, and the weather there is like notoriously depressing. So that like compounded the issue where I was at. And so anyway, I remember, a little bit of time went by, and I remember I was sitting there watching TV one day. I think I was stoned or something, probably because everybody smokes weed over there, and especially back then, everybody was like super. Everybody I knew grew weed. It was just like the thing in the Pacific Northwest. And so I was sitting there, and I was flipping through the TV channels, and EWTN came on, or I flipped through it, and there was something to do with Pope Benedict. And I remember just watching it for a minute, and I had this thought, like, what the hell are they doing? Like, these people are like, what are they doing? They're dressed like retards. They have all this weird outfit on, and these doilies, and like, it just was bizarre to me. And I remember specifically, I don't know, it was some kind of a papal mass outside when they do the big, it might have been like World Youth Day. It was something big like that.
Yeah.
And I was watching Benedict do his thing, and I just had this moment where I went, this is weird, but it's kind of interesting. And I remembered, I grew up Catholic. I remember going to mass, and I remember all this. But everything that I know about Roman Catholicism, I've been taught, or what I think I know, I was taught in these evangelical churches. Now, if you've ever gone to an evangelical church and they start talking about Roman Catholicism, especially like the Chuck Smith Calvary Chapel crew, it's just the stupidest. I mean, bless their hearts, no offense. It's nonsense, basically. It's like dispensationalist Whore of Babylon fan fiction. It's nonsense. And so almost every single thing is a caricature. But that's what I knew. I knew a little bit about the Reformation from Mark. He was sort of honest, but obviously he had, he was on Luther's side, and so he didn't really ever have anything positive to say about the Roman Catholic Church. I did have an inkling of maybe there's something here because I was super into R.C. Sproul, and or at least I used to be. I always listened to his podcast, even though I didn't get a lot of it because he was like just a genius Reformed theologian dude. And anyway, and I remember him talking about Aquinas. I remember the name Aquinas, and I remember Augustine. He talked about Augustine all the time. And anyway, so I decided I'm going to get on the internet and just look up stuff about the Catholic Church. And I remember I went to this website. I think it may have been Wikipedia, but it may not have been. I can't remember. But it was this like basic website. And I looked up stuff about the popes, and it blew my mind. It was one of those moments where, like, I don't know what that's called in the movies, where the person stays in shot, but like the background goes whoosh. There's like a name for it. I don't know what it is, but I felt like that when I read this. And I remember looking and seeing Pope Benedict, and there's all these names, like a list, all the way back to the beginning, all the way back to the time of the apostles. And that just stunned me. And I had this moment where I went, oh my God, this is insane that by name, I didn't know that, up until this point, by name, there was a successor by name all the way back 2,000 years. And that was that blew my mind. And so I was very interested. And there was something about watching this liturgy or whatever they were doing, the ritual, the ceremony. And I should say, at that time, I had just become a Freemason. Oddly enough, no, that's kind of out of left field. But there's a lot of tattooers that are Freemasons. It's kind of a weird thing within tattooing. I don't want to say a lot, like it's thousands and thousands, but there is a sizable community of Freemasons within tattooing. And I never really went super far with it. I never dove into like the super esoteric, York Rite or whatever. I had just done my initiation and was on my way, making my way through the first 3 degrees, basically. And so, but I'd done my initiation and stuff, and so I had been searching and interested in trying to find some sort of transcendence for my life, because I've always been that way. I've always wanted there to be more, even though I was a cynical dork about it or whatever. And so anyway, I jump in and learn all this stuff about the popes, and then I discovered that there is this line of people filing out of Protestantism and into Catholicism, and that was a moment. Because you know, the churches I went to, you never heard that. It was always like, I was saved out of Roman Catholicism, and the Lord saved me, and brought me out of the horror of Babylon. Like, those are the stories you hear. These
Yeah.
people that they leave the evil Catholic Church and become real Christians. Well, I saw, no, this is a two-way street. There's a lot of people that go the other way, and they have very compelling reasons for why they did. So I started listening to Catholic Answers. This was a long time ago, when it was not, it's really milquetoast now, but it was sort of like that then, but it was still a little, Mother Angelica was still alive. And so EWTN was a little more, I don't know, it was just, it wasn't edgy, but it was different. And I started watching her. I started watching EWTN. It was just interesting to me. There was something about it. And having grown up Catholic, it was almost like a familiarity that
Yeah.
that I was grasping onto, even though I didn't really understand it. And looking back now, I could tell you I had already, I don't know if it was subconscious or whatever, some Jungian thing where I embraced this, or I don't know, but I can look back now and go, that was reading about the popes, and those couple of days I had fundamentally converted back. Like, I was like, there's something to this. And so I started reading more about Christ, and I decided, okay, there's something here. I think I read, I made it through half of The Everlasting Man by Chesterton.
Mhm.
Or was it, I think it was that. Yeah, I think it was Everlasting Man. And Chesterton is, it's not that he's hard to, Chesterton is not difficult to read or understand. He's just fatiguing. He's like, he makes me tired when I read it, because it's like every other line is some, like, it's some witticism, or he, like, if you've read Chesterton, like, it's very rich and it's easy to understand, but it's written in a certain way. It's where it's not just, you don't just sit down and like blah 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 blah. You really have to kind of parse what's there in order to
Yeah, take your
really.
time with it.
Exactly. And so I got through enough of it to go, maybe I should just read C.S. Lewis. So I moved on, and I was still reading stuff about Catholicism, but I think it was a friend of mine, a Christian friend of mine, who recommended Mere Christianity. So I had never read that before. And so I read that and was utterly convinced, okay, well, I guess I never really stopped believing in Christ, but it's the church thing. And this, I won't go into all of it because it would be a 2-hour podcast, but this was just like, the scales fell from my eyes, and all of these things fell into place. And then I discovered, he's a bishop now, but I discovered Father Robert Barron, and now he's Bishop Barron, his Word on Fire. And, he does have a like Daily Wire now, unfortunately, but at the time he was just some random priest who made these like really short YouTube videos. They were well produced, especially for that time, but they were just like 5, 7, 10-minute long, about very specific topics that people would ask him. And he answered so many of my questions, just watching some of those. I think this was like maybe 2008.
Yeah, very early YouTube.
Yeah, it was like 2008. I can't get my year. I'm getting old, so my years are mixed up. 2009, maybe. He hadn't been doing it very long. And then I discovered Aquinas, and then I was able to kind of put those two together and go, oh, I remember hearing about him. This is, the first move, all that stuff. I won't go into all of it, but so I ended up going, okay, this Catholicism thing is pretty cool. I'm going to go to a mass. And I ended up going to a mass in the town I was in, and it was all right. There's a bunch of like old Mexican ladies there and me, but it was a daily mass. So I went, and it was cool. I met with the priest afterward, and it was odd because he was one of those Anglican ordinariate priests. So he was married, which
Yeah.
is like not common. And I met with him. He was super cool. He was kind of jaded because I was like, "Hey, I'm interested in becoming a Catholic. What do I need to do?" And I told him my backstory, and he said, "Well, you're already Catholic. You just come to confession, and then you just start going to church. You're in the club, man." And so I said, "Okay, cool, let's do it." And he was like, "Yeah, okay, but just got to let you know, this parish is basically Mexicans who don't know English, so you're more than welcome here, but you're probably not going to like it." So he almost verbatim told me that. Not verbatim, but he pretty much said that. And I was like, okay, um, okay, cool. Is there another place to go? He's like, yeah, I mean, there's another Catholic church, but it's up in Bellingham, which is like, it's not that far, but it's far enough to be annoying from where I was
Yeah.
living. And so I was like, okay, cool. And so I went home and I was digging around online, and just by chance, there was this info for a church that popped up, an Orthodox church. And it was about as far as the other Catholic church in Bellingham. And so I started reading about it, and they just so happened to be this parish who all converted to Orthodoxy from evangelicalism during the big, like, Peter Gilchrist
Yeah.
thing. And anyway, so I was like, well, that's cool. Oh, yeah, the iconography. I'd seen a little bit of that as a Catholic, going through Catholicism or whatever, or digging back into Catholicism. And I'd read a little bit about it. And I'm condensing like a year here, okay, maybe a little more. And I decided, I see their schedule. I'm like, I'm just going to go to their mass. So I drive up there and I go to the liturgy, and it was like insanely long. I wasn't used to, I mean, now I'm used to them, but it was like 2.5, 3 hours. And I'm just like, because I showed up at like before matins, I was just like there in the parking lot, like, I'm here for this church for the mass. And I go in, and it's like me and the reader. The priest wasn't even there yet. It was like me and the
Yeah.
reader and the guy, that some other people. Everyone was really nice, very, very cool. In fact, some of the people that go there I know now, and like one of the people who painted some of the iconography there is a good friend of mine. It's really weird, if you're Orthodox, it's a small world anyway.
Oh
But
yeah.
it's,
Everyone's 2 or 3 degrees away from the rest of
yeah,
the Orthodox world with the U.S.
basically, yeah. And so it's interesting now to look back on. But so I went to liturgy there, and it was cool. I looked at the iconography; it was cool, or whatever. But it didn't really grab me. It wasn't this like, we didn't know whether we were in heaven or on. I didn't have one of those experiences. It was
Yeah.
definitely interesting, but it was very foreign, and I had no reason to not want to still be Catholic, because it was just like, oh well, this parish might not be right for me, but I had no issue with like the Catholic Church. So keep that in mind. I hadn't really jumped into going to mass all the time, and parish life, the lived life of the Catholic Church. I hadn't really done that yet. My whole experience had been online and reading books, and this beautiful Western traditional Christian faith. It's 2,000 years old, and all these great saints. And I was learning about Padre Pio and all these saints, and Fatima and Our Lady of Lourdes. And so anyway, I decide, I'm gonna go to this parish during the week, and then I'm gonna go to this one in Bellingham. So I did that for a little while, and it was okay. Nothing wrong with it. I still didn't really connect. There's something off a little bit. I didn't really. I wasn't. I hadn't dug my heels in enough to see where the problem I'm going to mention in here in just a few minutes. And so around that time, we decided to move to the area we're in now, which is basically, we're in the west side of Washington, and we decided to move out to the east side of Washington, where I had lived before I'd moved to the west side. And we did that for a number of reasons, but my wife has family over here and yada, yada, yada. So we moved out over here, and as luck would have it, there's where I'm at, there's a big cathedral, a big Catholic cathedral, which is gorgeous. It's a big 110-year-old cathedral, the Cathedral of Our Lady of Lourdes in Spokane, Washington. Absolutely gorgeous church. I love it to this day. I was blessed, actually, with the opportunity to paint a huge Baroque style painting of a St. Peregrine, a Catholic saint, for one of their shrines. It was a huge honor for me to do that, because I just love this church, and I love the community there still to this day. I love the priest. I like Bishop Daly. I love everything about that church to this day. So when I moved back here, I started going to their RCIA, which is the Rite of Christian Initiation for adults.
Yeah.
And I liked the parish life or whatever. It was cool. But I noticed when I was in RCIA, now I didn't have to do this. I was going to confession and communion and daily mass and stuff. But my friend, the rector, said, you'd probably really like it. And why not? It's free. It's a catechism class. Go, And he said, you'll learn a lot. And so I went. And I, of course, was like the one or two people out of like the 25 people in the class would like raise my hand and ask questions. Everybody else was there because they were getting married. And it was like something they had to do.
Yeah.
I was the guy that's like, in the catechism it says, and everybody like roll their eyes. And the transitional deacon, which he wasn't, well, I think he was gay, but honestly, but he wasn't transitional. I don't mean he was like becoming a woman. It's in the Catholic Church, when you're in seminary to become a priest, you become a transitional deacon. So we do it in the Orthodox Church, but it takes like a weekend. You get ordained a deacon and then a priest like the next day. Well, in the Catholic Church, for some reason, they keep their deacons around for however long. So that's what he was. He was becoming a priest. But I could tell he didn't like me because I kept asking all these questions. And so these things started to build where I was like, the people are nice or whatever, but I'm not really, there's something off here. This religion, this faith, this historic, beautiful faith that I read about in all these books, I'm not really experiencing here in the parish. And I'm in this beautiful traditional parish with statues, and it's this giant cathedral, but something just was not quite right. And so I did that for a while, and then I forget what I was reading. I was reading more church history, and I started reading more about Orthodoxy. Well, I ended up discovering, I came across like Death of the World, and met this guy that's a writer, was a writer for them at the time, who was a Catholic, who became Orthodox. He's still a friend of mine to this day. And through him, I met Abbot Trifon, I've known him for years and years now. He's still to this day, my confessor and spiritual father. But I met him through my friend Jason, who was a writer for Death of the World years ago. And through him, I discovered, I wouldn't say I discovered Orthodoxy, but something clicked there that didn't click for me in the Catholic Church. And so I decided, okay, I'm gonna be a Catholic, but I'm gonna read more about this Orthodox thing. And so I started reading more about it, and I realized, okay, there's some major departure. This isn't how Catholic Answers told me several years ago. This isn't like, oh, well, there are separated brethren that are just like us, but just, they don't accept the Pope and that's it. No. There's some serious problems here. There's some differences. And one of the things that stood out for me with Orthodoxy that I immediately found was compelling is so I should back up. One of the things that I didn't like about Roman Catholicism was the almost obsession with like Medjugorje and miraculous stuff. And like, I think that stuff's interesting, and it's a great, testament to the reality of Christianity. But there was like an almost unhealthy obsession with like the miraculous medal and all of these apparitions of the Virgin Mary. And it was unsettling for me. And so when I discovered Orthodoxy and I started reading writings from Orthodox saints, one of the things that stood out for me was the instruction to basically ignore that stuff, or to be very skeptical of it, and to not just dig into it like it's true. Oh, look, it's Jesus. You're supposed to reading about reading monastic or Orthodox monastic literature. Like the first thing they tell the novice is, yeah, if you have this experience, it's 9 times out of 10 it's the devil, or it's a demon or something, or treat it as such because it's probably that, and go about your business, because you'll end up in what is called prelust, or delusion. You'll end up in spiritual delusion. And this concept is not something that I'd ever encountered in Roman Catholicism. Now, I'm sure there's Catholics listening, they'll well actually me and say that, yes, St. John of the Cross talks about, like, I get it, it's there. But let's be honest, there is Orthodoxy, we have our problems. I'm not going to say we're flawless or we don't have struggles in some areas, but Roman Catholicism, there seems to be a major issue with these weird apparitions and like weeping statues that aren't real, and this like superstitious kind of thing. And that always was an issue for me personally. And so to discover that, and not just that, there was a lot of things. And but beyond that, there was something about Orthodoxy that I can't even to this day, I can't enunciate or define this is why specifically. It was just compelling. It was just like, okay, that's where I need to be. And it wasn't a feeling either. It was just like, I felt like I'd parked the car finally. When I was a Roman Catholic, I felt like, okay, I'm in the car and it's idling, and I'm kind of driving here and there, but I never felt settled. I always felt like Father Thomas Hopko, one of my favorite quotes of his that I'm going to paraphrase because I'm not as eloquent as him. He said, oftentimes people get high off of the search, like the discovery of the search for the one true church. And so when they when they oftentimes when they leave orthodoxy, it's because they've arrived at orthodoxy, and instead of doing what you're supposed to do and continue the search but change your perspective and look upwards. You're not supposed to continue to look horizontally. You're supposed to change your perspective and look upwards and seek God. It's the same idea. I felt like I had tried to do that in Roman Catholicism, but something just was off. There was just, I can't put it into words. I just did not feel settled. I didn't feel at home, or whatever you want to say. And so when I discovered a few things about Orthodoxy, yeah, the history, and yeah, the arguments about the filioque, and that stuff has never been what has gripped me. It's the spirituality of the Orthodox Church, and just broadly speaking, all of that other stuff's important, but that's not what hooked me. That's not what convinced me. It was all of it, and the fact that I just had this. I felt myself settle, and it calmed something within me, um, in my being or whatever, that I didn't get that from anywhere else. And it's very subtle, and it's not something I realized at the time. I wasn't like, "Oh, I'm not a spaz now. I should be orthodox." Like, it was something that in hindsight, that I look back now and I go, that's why I stayed put there, and why I felt closure on my search for God, because I believe it is the one true historic church, but B, I realized I was still not quite satiated in Roman Catholicism. So I ended up going to this Greek church in town for a little bit. The priest, very cool. I still know him to this day. Awesome guy, awesome community. But he suggested I go to the Antiochian parish because it's all converts, and he was right. I went up there and met the priest. I mean, the rest is history. I
Yeah.
came into the Orthodox Church relatively quickly. Um, my wife was all in, and so yeah, we've been Orthodox ever since. So
Yeah, I think that does highlight, I think, a struggle, or I think that story to me feels very common to almost everyone I've talked to, is the search, and then there's this moment that you feel like you can park the car, so to
right,
speak, and be settled. I mean, for me, it was I went to a lot of churches before finally making the commitment myself. It was the Episcopalians. I went to even a traditional Latin mass, which I still think is incredibly beautiful. And I'm
same,
not, I'm not going to go into Roman Catholic Church politics. It is a depressing factor to see it under attack for what it is, because it is very
right,
beautiful. It is very there's something very sacred there. And then at the same time, I went to, like my grandmother's like Baptist church and things like that, trying to feel things that I could growing up at
yeah,
home. And but for me, it was the liturgy itself, because as soon as I had stepped in and heard the opening and then the amen of the choir reply, I was like, I think I'm home.
hmm,
And I sort of stopped the whole church shopping thing, as people say, right afterwards. And a lot of people have similar experiences where something finally clicks, whether it's the reading of the spiritual life or the saints, or just the experience of church practice. Because if you're doing what you're supposed to do, read scripture daily, fast Wednesdays and Fridays, like you're going to see a fundamental transformation in people, and you witness it yourself as well. And I think that's a big reason why people stick. And so I think that sort of gives you a good transition now to, you have all this artistry experience. I mean, did you seek out your talents, or was it an autodidact thing? Was this like, well, I'm just gonna like learn how to do it and then just try it myself, or did you find an instructor or something like that? Because for me, my audience knows that I've started. I don't want to say dabble in it anymore. I've been doing too many of them now to say I'm dabbling. But I have a friend of mine at my parish, and she is an iconographer. And she and I have sort of a mutual background of like we've both gone through some like really harrowing medical experiences. Like she just beat
Hmm.
cancer, and I came into the church, after my kidney transplant, and we were both sort of like curmudgeonly, just complaining about our health problems and our issues. And so I asked sort of outright, I said I would love to learn. And so I sort of learned from her and learned the theology and the writings of the saints and the fathers about iconography. But for you,
Hmm.
was it I'm going to just try it myself, or was there an instructor or a teacher or someone in that area?
Well, no. I so I, I'm self-taught, but that's not a I'm, pat on my own back. I'm self-taught because of just the nature of where we live. We live in the United States, and there's not really we don't have access to the traditional path in which you would learn iconography in an Orthodox country. Like in Russia, you can literally learn it at the university. You can learn it at your parish, like you did, from someone that's highly skilled. You don't have to sort of be lucky. Like you're lucky to have someone in your parish who has an iconography background. Not every parish has that, and so I mean, there's workshops and stuff, but we don't have this. We just don't have the resources in America to learn how to paint iconography and to learn traditionally at a high level, I guess you could say. So I've always been this way. By the way, it's how I learned to do everything. I I, I'm self-taught, but I've providentially encountered like the iconography community in general. I've found is a very unique, mostly a unique art community worldwide because people are very willing to pull you up to where they're at. Whereas in my experience, because I also oil paint and I paint contemporary portraiture or whatever goofy, pretentious term you want to use. I do a lot of traditional academic style oil painting along with tattooing. I've done some study, I guess you could say, some advanced study in that realm. And so in that art world, the art world in general, regardless of whatever like niche style, whether you're a modern artist and impressionist, whatever you want to call whatever it is that you do, there's usually the community is full of people who are painfully insecure who tie their self-worth to what they create. Now we all do that to one degree or another. That's a healthy thing to do, but artists have a tendency to be more insecure, I found. And I know that
Mhm.
from personal experience. Like artists in general, whether it's musicians, struggle with this too. And I think that's why creative people in general struggle with um, being self-conscious and tying their self-worth to what they create. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it can become sort of this like psychosis if you don't keep it in check. And so if people reject what you're creating, if you possess any sort of self-awareness, you'll either go back and try to get better or to like totally crush your soul. And so that's why some people can't take criticism, even
Yeah.
like a gentle critique. Because they've tied so much of who they are to what they produce. And that's a whole aspect of when I teach workshops, I go over this very specifically with people so that we can right out of the gate confront that and put it where it needs to be because you can't ever get away from it as an iconographer, but you need to subjugate it and face it head on so that it doesn't become a monster that gets in the way of your progression and gets in the way of the iconography. But again, that's a whole other thing. But so yeah, I'm self-taught, but I've had a lot of people have offered. I've asked questions and people have helped along the way. I have a friend. She paints professionally in the Seattle area. She's a priest's wife and she's a great iconographer. And she helped me out of the gate because I just emailed her and was like, "Hey, I'm a tattoo artist. I converted to Orthodoxy recently, and this is something I'm interested in. And this is what I had done some stuff on my own, I had a little bit of an edge as far as learning iconography on my own, or non-traditionally, I guess you could say, not under a specific teacher, because I'm a tattoo artist.
Yeah.
And the job of a tattooer is unique because I spent, well, 20 years, over 20 years now, but taking an image and reverse engineering it and then rebuilding it in a different medium on somebody's body.
Yeah.
So not always. I mean, you would. It's not like it's just copying images all the time, but there's a tattooing heavily. That's a huge part of tattooing, and so I've gained a skill set to be able to take a piece of art and with oil painting. One of the ways you learn how to oil paint quickly, and this is a traditional method, by the way. Like Rembrandt, his pupils, his apprentices in their workshop, he would teach them to paint this way. This is a very common way of learning to paint, even now at like, a friend of mine teaches at the Angel Academy in Florence, I think. And this is one of the classes that he teaches. He teaches a Caravaggio, Caravaggio is like one of my favorite painters of all time, but he teaches a Caravaggio class. And what you do is what are called master copies, where you have a painting, and it could be an old master's painting, whoever, Rubens, Rembrandt, whatever, and you paint a copy of that painting. And what it does is, usually you get a little guidance right out of the gate from an experienced painter, but what it does is it teaches you the sequential technique on how to achieve that specific painting, that specific look. And it really is oil painting specifically really is a very systematic, at least the traditional academic, I guess, oil painting in general is very systematized. There are these different approaches and how to get your painting to look a certain way. All that gets thrown out of the window in the 20th century, that's when art becomes about expressing yourself. And again, that's a whole other conversation, but painting in general, that overshadows the technical aspects of painting. People go to art school and they aren't taught these things. It's really weird. Like, you spend $100,000 or whatever on an art school education, and it's like you could spend $8,000 and go to like an atelier for a few weeks in the summer in Toronto or something and learn a gazillion times more than you'd learn at these big art schools like the Boston Art Conservatory or something. But anyway, my point is that having done oil painting and all this other stuff and excelled at art in a, like, I excel at art when it's in a systematized approach or systematized techniques, excuse me. And there's art where it's not done that way, where it's very expressive and you can just do whatever, and however it works out, that's great. But I've always excelled at art within a tradition, basically. And so with iconography, I remember I would stand at liturgy with my family, and my mind would wander. Everybody's mind wanders, but we'd always be up front, and I'd stare at the icons, and I would try to, in my mind, just back engineer, like, okay, I wonder how this works. Well, at the time, there wasn't all these videos like there are now on the internet. Luckily, there's a ton of stuff on YouTube now that just didn't exist. And so I befriended a guy, a Russian gentleman he's a monk now, but just brilliant guy. He really turned the key a little bit. We just had a correspondence, email friendship or whatever. And he really unlocked a lot of the stuff and explained to me a little bit about basic techniques and a supply list on what to buy. And honestly, man, I just started doing it. And whenever somebody will message me or ask me, how do I get started? What do I do? My answer, it sounds kind of glib, but I just say, just do it. Just start, just paint. You're going to paint terrible icons, but just do it. One of the things I teach in my workshops, one of the first few days, is how to practice and how to do so affordably so that you're not painting on these expensive
Yeah,
panels,
no one wants beautiful firewood, as my teacher would say.
Yes, exactly. So you have to have a way to practice that's similar to how you're going to paint on one of these icon panels. And so anyway, I have a whole way that I teach people what to buy and how to do it or whatever. And so I just did a ton of that. The whole 10,000 hours thing is true. If you put a bunch of time into something, inevitably, especially art, it requires a modicum of like a small amount of like a foundational skill set. But our art is a skill and a trade. It's not really a talent. There are people that are better at it than others, but I'm of the philosophy that anyone can learn how to paint or how to paint or how to do art exceptionally well. Now, what separates someone who's doing really exceptional versus professional, like high quality versus something exceptional, well, that comes down to the person and their artistic vision or whatever. Obviously, there's a separation there. But as far as speaking just purely technically, almost anyone can learn these skills in order to paint at a proficient level. And the only thing it really requires is almost like an autistic, obsessive drive to do so, because you have to hyper focus on it. And so that's essentially what I did. I painted a couple icons because I have a painting background. It came relatively, it made sense. I'll just say, like I started to figure things out quickly, and it was just a matter of trial and error and learning. And I would talk to some other iconographer, mostly just email somebody, or I would meet someone in a Facebook group or something, and they kind of help you out along the way. And so I did that for a few years, and then there was a church that was having the murals painted inside of it. The wall painting's done by this gentleman from Serbia, and I connected with him, and he is sort of the closest thing I have to a formal teacher or someone who I would consider. I hate the term mentor because that sounds like I'm like a troubled teen, that like that's just what the mental picture I get. But that he's the closest thing I have to a teacher in a formal capacity, and I started helping him out as much as I could, and he was sort of someone that I could access as I went. And I worked with him a bit here and there when I could. Worked on some projects that he was working on, and anyway, I did that over a period of 11 years now, and just invested time, energy, and effort into it. I rearranged my entire life to paint iconography, and yeah, so I did that, and then the last couple of years, I've taken over. My friend, my Serbian friend, who is my mentor, you could say, he's had some health issues, and as God would have it, I've taken over a couple of his projects. There's one I'm working on in Montana now. It's a restoration technically. He had painted this church like 20 years ago. They had a bunch of damage to the walls, water damage, and so they had to basically rebuild part of the church. And
Wow.
so I'm going in and doing the restoration. It's not a one-for-one restoration where I'm just copying what was there. We're using the same layout, same schema that he had designed, but I'm painting it, same color palette and everything. But he told me improve upon it, do your own thing, which there is room for. Contrary to popular belief, there's a lot of room for creativity within iconography. That's part of what it's all about, really. Is there's creativity within the tradition, not you don't want to venture outside of it, but if you're doing it correctly, there's a lot of room for expression or creativity. It just naturally happens. So anyway, yeah, I'm doing that, and then I'm also finishing. There's a church, the church in Yakima, that he painted. He did, I would say, I don't know percentage wise. It's a little over half, and then the rest of it, I actually was just there a couple days ago meeting with the priest, and I'm gonna take over that when I'm done in Montana. So I'm doing more of that, which, well, that's a project behind me here in my studio. That's where my main interest is. Like I do enjoy doing panel icons, but the end goal was always to do wall painting, and um, that's sort of where my attention and focus is now, is doing these projects and providentially seeing, where else God leads me with that. So
I was about to say, as someone who's only done sort of the panel icons, how do you approach, the walls themselves? I mean, I know
mm,
that some do sort of like the canvas work and then apply it on
hmm
there. I know absolutely nothing. So I mean, I would love to just pick your brain and just how
yeah,
does that work between getting it on the board, contouring that? I mean, I imagine it's a lot like what you were talking about with tattoos. Like you just try and get it to work with the curvature of the wall or like the
hmm
frame of someone's body, but which makes sense because we when we consecrate churches, we treat them like people, so they are bodies.
right,
But,
right.
yeah, how does that work? Because I've seen some of your videos on Twitter where you're talking about how the process works, all the paints that you have to mix and everything. I
hmm
mean, what is the biggest difference between, just obvious panel versus wall? But, how does one approach that?
Well, there is a so when it comes to doing when you lay out what's called the mural schema, where everything goes, there's obviously an order of precedent as far as the images go. There's flexibility within that, generally speaking, from the dome, the pendentives, all the way down. There's a lot of flexibility, and it all depends on how the church is shaped. That's a that would be a really long conversation to go into all that and the history of that, but I'll maybe we could do that another day. But as far as the actual painting goes and the differences between the two, there is a huge difference between a panel icon and something that you would see a fresco or a wall painting. And the differences are this: the approach is different because, number one, I think the most important thing is the way in which you paint. You don't necessarily want to paint everything very smooth, as far as you almost want to be, rough is the wrong term, but you want to leave your brush strokes visible because of the viewing distance. And if you notice in some of these older churches on like Mount Athos or anywhere in the world where it's an older church, the higher up you go, oftentimes the rougher the painting is, meaning the more loose it is. And that's because when you're viewing a panel icon, you can get everything super smooth and these really smooth blends and transitions. And if that's the style you're going for, you can do that, and it makes sense because what's the viewing distance like right here? Well, if you're in a church and you're viewing an icon that's on the wall and it's up 20 feet in the air, if you have these really smooth transitions in the flesh tone and stuff, it takes a long time to do that, and it's actually not going to look very good when you're on the ground. You want to have these extreme separations between the different steps or the different values that you're using, because the eye will naturally blend those things at a distance, right? And
Yeah.
so it's similar with like an oil painting. If you look at like John Singer Sargent, you can see, well, he's a great example because he's like one of the best at this. But you see all these brush strokes if you get up on something, the paint's all kind of impressionistic. You don't want to
Mhm.
go that far with iconography, but it's the same principle. You step back from this painting. Well, here's something everybody will know: Van Gogh.
Yeah.
Okay, let's take a look at some like the sunflower painting or something. If you look up on that real close, it's going to look chaotic. I mean, it'll still probably look cool, but it's going to look very chaotic, and you can see all the brush strokes. It's not going to be very smooth. But if you step back and look at it at viewing distance, even further back than that, everything is just beautiful. All the little values and different shifts in color temperature, it all plays together and creates one image. While with an icon at a distance, it's the exact same thing. So there's that approach. It's a different approach as far as that goes. But also, I mean, it depends too on the medium that you're using. A lot of you know the pigments are generally the same. You have the pigment and you have the medium, which is functionally dirt and glue. That's pretty much what it is.
Yeah.
And so the medium or the binder, what holds the pigment, it changes. And I would say that the most common mediums that are used in iconography today, it used to just be fresco, that's a term people loosely use for a painting on a wall. Fresco. Oh, look at the fresco. Even when
Yeah.
it's a different medium, people just say fresco. But fresco is actually a medium and a way of painting. And it involves semi-dry plaster, wet, but not wet. It's wet, it's dry, but it's not completely dry and cured. And you have to paint with pigment on there. It's this whole process. You have to do it in stages, basically. And it's an approach to painting iconography, and that's how all of our old churches on Athos and stuff are painted. There are a lot of people that still do that in like Romania and in Russia. Some people still do it, but nowadays, especially in Greece, the prevailing medium used in Greece is acrylic. Now that's usually not store bought tubed acrylic paint. You can certainly use that, but it tends to have more of a plasticky look to it because the pigments, there's more of the glue, more of the binder or medium in it than you want for iconography.
Yeah.
So it gives it kind of a plasticky look. I personally don't care for it. Some people use it though, and they do all right with it. There's nothing canonically wrong with using acrylic. People turn up their nose and scoff at acrylic in America and a little bit in Russia too. I don't, I think it's dumb, but if it's used correctly, it's used a lot in Serbia, it's used a lot in Greece, it's used somewhat in Romania. It just depends on the part of the world. But predominantly in Greece, you have a lot of people using acrylic on canvas, and that technique is done for two reasons. Number one, it's easier for the church community because you won't have scaffolding and this team of iconographers there for months on end. The iconographer will go in and take measurements and meet with the church. And let's say you're just doing part of the church. So you'll go in and take measurements, figure out what you're going to put up there. You'll go home to your studio, do like this. You'll paint whatever it is, bring the canvas back, and you'll apply it to the wall, similar to wallpaper, to be honest. The technique is called maroflage. It's this fancy French term, but it's just basically wallpaper. You use the same tech, you use the same materials you would for wallpaper for the most part. And so that's how that's applied. And the pros of that are a lot of the times, a lot of churches are constructed traditionally with concrete or plaster, but a lot of the time, especially in America and somewhat in Greece, modern building materials are used. And by modern building materials, I mean drywall. And drywall, we really don't know. It's not really built to last 500-600 years, I guess. We don't know really because it's a modern building material. But one of the benefits of having your iconography glued to the wall as opposed to painted directly on the wall is if there's damage to the wall, you can take the iconography off. Construction team can come in and redo the wall, and then the iconographer can come back and reapply the iconography, and that saves the parish a lot of money, and it doesn't really change the church. It's just we repaired what was there. So there's pros with that. Cons is that it doesn't age the same, and it's kind of a give and take, but we don't really know yet because it's such a new thing. It's kind of a new way of doing it, and so we'll see in a couple hundred years if this was a smart idea to do. But it's very common in Greece. Another way that they do, another way that iconography is done, wall painting iconography, is a type of medium called silicate. And it has sort of you get a similar effect to true fresco. So what happens with true fresco is I wonder if I could see. Yeah. Okay. So you have the wall right here.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, so you have the wall, and oftentimes paint is applied and it sets on the surface of the wall. And it adheres to the wall. Okay. Same with canvas. It'll soak in a little bit, but generally speaking, paint adheres on the surface. Well, with fresco, when I said earlier, it was, you have to do it when the plaster is dry, but not completely dry. It's because you want it chemically, you want the pigment that you're applying to actually go into the wall. And so then it becomes part of the wall. It's not just on the surface. So that's why fresco, like the Sistine Chapel, is fresco as well. It's not just iconography. Like a lot of Western churches and Western art, non-religious art, you see done in fresco, and it actually becomes a part of the surface, almost like stone. I mean, it literally is within the actual substrate of the wall. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, this silicate medium mimics that, but it does it through a different kind of chemical process, and that is really, really popular in Russia. Like that's sort of the, I don't want to say the standard, I guess, but most of the people I know are using that paint technology there, when painting in a more Neo-Byzantine or traditional Russian Byzantine style of iconography. A lot of people still do traditional fresco, but that silicate is done that way. In Dallas at St. Seraphim, a lot of that is silicate, and some of it is acrylic too, I believe.
Some
But
of
when,
it.
yeah, I think I don't quote me, but I'm pretty sure. I don't know the iconographer, but I know someone who does know him, and we were talking about it. He was saying that, but the acrylic. So this is acrylic. Most of the time, when you have iconography on canvas, it's applied to the wall. More often than not, it's acrylic. But like I said earlier, it's not acrylic tube from the store. I actually have some right here. It's pigment. This is just yellow ochre. This is the same pigment you would use for egg tempera.
Yeah.
Which egg yolk and pigment. It's the same exact pigment, but it's mixed with an acrylic medium, and so the paint is almost exactly the same as what you would find with egg tempera, but instead of egg yolk, we just use acrylic medium. And so the trick is you want to use just enough of the medium so that you don't get pigment coming off. It's almost what's called under tempered, meaning it doesn't, it sticks to the wall, but it's not super glossy. That's basically what we're looking for. But we'll make the paint, and then you should either bottle it up like that, or sometimes some iconographers will do it where they'll have their powdered pigments out, and then they'll have but they do this a lot in Greece, and then they'll have their medium and kind of mix as they go. There's a lot of different ways. My point in illustrating that is to show that sometimes people labor under this delusion, or this delusion's wrong. That sounds negative. They have this misconception that there is a way to do iconography, almost like it's karate or kung fu. Like there's this one way, and there's these set of techniques, and if you don't have them just right, it's not a real icon, and you're going to get excommunicated. And it's great that people approach it with fear and trembling. Like you really want to be aware of. You want to approach it with reverence and with fear and trembling. That's very smart, and it's how you're supposed to do that. But as far as the technical aspects of how the painting is done, it's not as black and white, pun intended. It's not as rigid, I guess, as some people make it out to be. I think because some people learn a very specific way. They like do a workshop, and they're like, "Oh, this is how you paint an icon," and it's like, well, you can, but I mean, I use a handful of different techniques in how I paint, and it just depends on, there's like the membrane technique and the proplasmos technique. There's all these there's a handful of different techniques, and you can kind of pull from each and every one. As an artist, I use techniques and ways of mixing color that I learned in oil painting, and that's where the creativity comes into it. That's where the uniqueness of a person's iconography comes in. We're working within the confinement of a tradition. There's legitimate, very spelled out borders here, but at the same time, there's a lot of room inside of that fenced area for creativity and doing something new and progressive in the best possible sense, contemporary in the best possible sense. And I had an iconographer, very established, very professional, high-level iconographer, explain that to me in a very humbling way many years ago that has always stuck with me. And so I mean, that's a lot. I kind of just opened the fire hose and was like, I'm sure people's eyes have glazed over now. He's talking about mediums again, but You asked for it, so there you go.
Well, you know, that's again, it's the best part of having a podcast is that you get to just talk to your friends, and you know,
And I literally just scratched the surface of that. You could,
yeah. I
I
mean,
mean, it's
there are
like,
so many ways that you can go from there. Because I
exactly.
mean, I have no acrylic background at all. Actually, I have no artistic background at all. I've always been more of a writer. I did a lot of poetry in high school and college. I got published in some places, and I mean, I fell in love with that. I think that every artist, regardless if it's a visual or textual medium, is I mean, they're their own best critic in that respect. I think that that's incredibly true, and people will eat themselves alive, like you said. And
Hmm.
I think that that gives anyone who does any kind of art form, I think, a greater appreciation of what other people go through in doing that. You know, I get to
Yeah.
walk a mile in somebody else's shoes when you know they talk about self criticism or how they apply their worth to their work, which is definitely true. Like you look at your own stuff and you're like, oh, you know, or like I could have done
Yeah.
better than there. But like you don't publicly talk about that to flash yourself. No one needs to see that. But um,
No.
well, I guess that does open up a fun question though about technique because you know
Hmm.
you and I have discussed privately. It's just like, well, I know one method, and I know that there are dozens, if not more than that.
Hmm.
And so I guess you know out of your experience of these schools or these techniques or these styles, I mean, what you know, what do you find to be the most accessible iconography school or technique? I mean, what is the one that you enjoy the most, or out of all the blends in which you sort of know, you know, what to you says that this is the way in which, for you at least yourself, right? I can start from here and then create an icon.
Boy, I think it so the handful of techniques that I use depend on the application, I guess. So if and it depends on the overall aesthetic that I'm going for in an like if I'm trying to paint something that's very um, connected to a very traditional is the wrong word. A very if I'm trying to do an icon that looks exactly like a Cretan icon, I use Cretan iconography as an example because it's the thing that people think of when I mention Orthodox iconography. It's probably the style that pops into people's head the most. Actually, just where you don't have any visuals, which makes it difficult. But I have a color study I did a long time ago. That's Cretan style
Mm,
iconography. Very distinct separation between the proplasmos, which is the green under or green shadowed areas. I'm trying not to use art jargon. And then you have the flesh tone here. Everything is very separated, and the colors are very distinct. It's either yellow ochre and that green, or it's like that yellowy flesh tone and that green. So that's Cretan style iconography. And that technique is very systematized. And one of the benefits of studying iconography under someone who learned it in that very systematized, first we do this, then we do this, like in Greece, even in Russia, there are names for each, and I'm sure you've learned this, each highlight, each subsequent layer of flesh tone, even down to the last white highlight at the end, which has its symbolic meaning and all that stuff. Each one of those has its own unique name
yep.
in Greek or Russian or Slavonic. But I don't really paint that way. And I know a lot of iconographers that don't. A lot of Russian iconographers don't paint that way. A lot of Greeks do because it's the way they train and their I think their approach is less romantic. Russians are just more more. It's they're Russians, so it's like there's more of a willingness to explore that. Romantic is like the only word I can think of, and they're very, very rigid, at least, and this is all my personal experience with friends of mine and colleagues and people I know that are Russian. They tend to be the most rigid about certain things, but also the most open-minded as far as trying new palettes within the confines of the tradition. So this idea that there was a period of time up until very recently, this embrace of getting back to the Byzantine aesthetic, like what you see here. I don't want to say it's new, but it's sort of a contemporary rediscovery of that in Russia and even in Greece. A lot of the iconography for a specific period of time before the early, I'd say, well, even early mid 20th century was very Western, very academic, as they say.
Mm.
Not all, but a lot of it was very heavily Western influenced, and along with the rejection of Western theology and more of a separation in some regards, the iconography took on a more Byzantine embrace, I guess. There was more of a trying to get back to the source. I don't want to use the heady theological words, but there was more of a re-embrace of the source. And so there's that, but at the same time, there's an embrace of very unique color palettes that work really well, like a really almost pastel color palette that's very popular in Russia. Some of that is sort of an accident of the medium of silicate paint. Some of it lends itself to that. But generally speaking, that is a contemporary direction that some iconographers are going in. There's also a heavy influence from Archimandrite Zenon, who's probably the most influential living iconographer. In my personal opinion, he'll go down in the annals of the history of iconography. He'll go down as an old master. I'm not saying anything about his sanctity, like I'm not saying he'll become a saint, but he will be as fondly looked upon and spoken about in the history books as Rublev and Theophanes the Greek and Astropis, all of the greats, Panselenos, all of the greats, Archimandrite Zenon will be. I mean, he has people that, for all intents and purposes, just copy his style of iconography. I mean, it's uniquely sort of his thing. This Romanesque. I don't know. I'm not super into it. I've done some of it, but it's just not really anything that I've really connected with as much. But there are people that straight up just copy what he's doing, and it's now, which is that's par for the course with iconography. But I've designed icons where people have painted their versions, and I painted versions of contemporary. This is just how it works.
Yeah, there's that popular meme of 12 different guys showing up with the same Christ Pantocrator icon. I mean, all of them are unique and separate in their own ways, and there's a great beauty in that, I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's the whole idea of the prototype, and it's expressed differently through each individual painter or whatever. But this guy, like, specifically has sort of unintentionally created his own school of iconography. By school, I mean style, period, not like he runs a school I mean, he does, I guess. People come and train with him, but it's not like a school by that definition. It's like a style. And so, there's a lot of people that just really, it speaks to them and they've kind of ran with it. And that's how iconography develops organically. God raises up certain people within the life of the church throughout the history of the church, and they are inspired by the Holy Spirit, and also has to do with the culture and their place in history. There's all of these things that contribute, just like music or poetry. Iconography is more than art, but it is art. That's what a lot of people, they almost forget that. It is art, but it's more than art, definitely, but it's also art at the same time. And that, some people, they want to hyper focus on, okay, well, it exists liturgically within the life of the church. Yes, but there is the aspect that I talk about all the time. I don't really publicly venture too far into the symbolism and all that stuff. That's sort of out of my wheelhouse. I'm not qualified to teach on that, and I don't want to be held accountable for that on the day of judgment. So I have, it's not that I don't have an education in that per se. I just want to be held responsible, to be honest. Like, I don't want to be like...
I say it quite often. I take James 3, very seriously about what teachers and what you say will be used harshly against you on that day of judgment. So I try to keep that in mind.
Exactly. And because it's art, but it's more than art.
Yeah.
I tread lightly with that stuff, and honest. I mean, we've talked about this. I think a lot of that stuff is the more extreme, like symbol stuff. I think is a little. It's a little conjectural, and yeah, and that's. I'll just
Oh,
leave
yeah,
it at
sure.
that.
Yeah, I'll leave it at
But
that. I mean,
it's not my thing. So, but as far as like talking about the history and development of iconography, but also the way in which it's painted, one of the things that I enjoy the most, especially if, in the context of a workshop, is when it clicks with someone who's interested, but they've been discouraged because they haven't been shown the way, like okay, I need to do this, 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 and this. And don't get me wrong, a systematic approach to painting an icon, that's correct. But you can depart from that. You can, it's not uncanonical or bad to use a different approach or to try a different color. If you're painting something and it looks like that goofus Catholic guy that paints like John Coltrane and then George Floyd, and then he'll paint like an Orthodox saint. I forget his name, brother or something.
yeah, I know who you're
You know,
referring to because I think he
yeah,
had gotten in trouble with some Catholic church not too long ago because he had also painted, I think, like Harvey Milk or something.
yeah,
Like,
yeah, yeah, that guy,
yeah, that guy. Yeah,
Lens or something. Yeah, that
something.
that guy is a goofus. Like he has, yeah, that really is. Like I hate when people say it's not a real icon, but in that case, that stuff isn't iconography, you know. And so
Yeah,
um, there is that aspect where it's like, okay, now you're just pursuing creativity for its own sake, and so we've totally lost the plot here. This is not what it's about. But if you are painting within the tradition, and that's only something that you can learn by being totally immersed in it and proactively being aware of the fact that there are limits. And I mean, there's been times where I've gotten up to the edge and I've had other iconographers say, "Ooh, I don't know about that," or "Hey, did you know you're not supposed to do that?" I'm like, "Oh, I didn't know that," you know. So, or that's frowned upon, or you know, sometimes there's theological reasons. I don't think I've ever crossed the line with that stuff, but yeah, there's some stuff you just don't do, and you know, you only learn that through experience, I guess. But as far as the actual approach, whereas I put this color down and then I do this technique, there is no like rule for that. If you get from point A to point B and you have a beautiful icon that is not a scandal and doesn't distract and serves its purpose as connecting the viewer with God or their saint or whatever is depicted, what you're doing is you're literally creating. It's like a time. It's not a time machine, but you are creating a connection with a person or an event. You know, I mean, what do we teach about the Eucharist, the consecration? You know, it's not happening all the time. It happened once. You know, and we revisit that. We all share in that. You know, so there's a little bit of that you can draw out of iconography. That happens to be one of my personal views on that. But at the end of the day, if you're painting something and it's now everyone has their own subjective likes and dislikes, but there are some times where an iconographer will paint something and maybe it falls within the bounds aesthetically of being iconographic, but something about it it separates it from the tradition. So like if it's something depicted that maybe you shouldn't have depicted, or that teaches error, or that might distract from the message that you're trying to convey with the icon or the saint you're trying to connect with. Like again, there's a lot of subjectivity here, and some people I've seen icons where I'm like, that thing has no business being in a church, and you'll have like 10 people that just love it. So I'm not quick to point fingers that this is not a real icon, or this was paint. I had someone years ago, a deacon of all people, a hierodeacon of all people, tell me that unless an icon is painted in egg temper, it's not a real icon. And I immediately knew that this guy didn't. It's like, bro, you just log off, man, because you don't know what you're talking about. I mean,
Yeah.
and this guy, I mean, he's a great guy, but it was a dumb thing to say, it's stuff like that. Everybody has their subjective opinion, but if I can in a class or something, and if I can cause that light to turn on, that like, oh, this isn't a role-playing game. I'm not going to get plus 10 painting skills once I unlock this. This isn't a martial art. Like, God's not going to be mad if I do a practice one and it doesn't turn out. I'll just try it again, and unlocking that and giving people permission to, like, this is art. It's okay. You can try and fail. And there's a lot of different paths up the mountain. I know we as Christians don't like that analogy, and there's a time and a place for it, and the time and the
Yeah.
place isn't when we're talking about Christianity in general, but when we're talking about art and even iconography, as far as the technical techniques, there's many paths to get to the summit of the mountain, which is a finished icon. So, I tell people, you'll eventually, if you paint long enough, you'll find your own set of, whether it's exactly how the person that taught you does it, which is totally fine. That's how we get these different schools and styles and workshops. It's literally how that develops. One person excels at this, and it has a wide, broad appeal, and a lot of people like it, and it's blessed by God. All of a sudden, you have a different school or style. Look at like Panselenos, okay? He had a very specific way of painting and drawing, and now that's like all Greek iconography looks. That's where all of the prototypes are. Panselenos and Michael Astropis and oh man, I had a long day. Eutychios, can't remember all my old Greek old masters' names, but there's several.
Yeah.
And so anyway, my point is that there are people that come along, Archimandrite, Xenon, who create things that these beautiful icons, and they might use drawing techniques that have pulled from these past iconographers, but they make it their own, and it's within the tradition. And how do we work as orthodoxy? It's accepted by the church, and so
Yeah.
then it just becomes canonical, at least in the context of iconography. And so that's when someone says, "Oh, it's a non-canonical icon," it's like, okay, well, is the church not accepting this? Because there's icons that at one time were canonical and now they're not, like the icon of God the Father. How
Yeah.
many churches do you walk in and there's that icon, and there was no problem up until recently? So, and that happens throughout the history of the
I
church.
know the famous one is the icon of Saint Christopher, with the
Oh
dog
yeah,
head that the
yeah.
Russian church had said no to back in the 1700s,
Mm-hmm.
and it's sort of been a dead non-canonical icon really since.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, as far as that goes, if something teaches error, obviously it's non-canonical. But people just, there's just a lot of misconceptions about terminology and how that works. And I think people, when I go into this stuff, people, not everyone, but a lot of people get uncomfortable with it because they realize that a lot of their preconceived categorizations, or like they think of iconography in almost a very juridical, make it
Mm-hmm.
like you make lists. Like there's a
Yeah.
book where it like I as an iconographer have a book and it tells me what's good and bad, and if I cross this line, then it's not a real icon. That doesn't exist. I mean, they have like, I mean, I have like the, there's like I have it sitting over the painting manual of Dionysius of Forna, like, or Forna or something. I don't know. There's some great stuff in there that is sort of a painter's manual that you would read, and how to do certain techniques, and you can look it up online. And there's some
Yeah.
great information in there, and information about the canonical way to paint this, or how you're supposed to depict this. Okay. And that's actually really important when you get into laying out murals. That stuff is actually very important. I'm
Mm-hmm.
not trying to devalue and say this isn't important, anything goes. That's not what I'm saying at all. What
Yeah.
I'm saying is that there's, being Westerners, we tend to, and that's such a cope sometimes. I hate even saying that because it's so, well, the Western way of view, like that's such a nonsensical thing that people do now. It's like a meme, you
Yeah.
know. I don't mean it in that way, but I do mean that people from Western Christianity, we come to Orthodoxy and think that everything is spelled out and defined. And that's not how this works with iconography. There is some of that, but it's not hyper specific all the time. And because it's living. It is a living, developing tradition, plural. There's multiple traditions within the church, and we live in an interesting, unique time because we all have access to images, whereas the church laity, the population of the church, whether you're Russia or you're a diaspora in America, 50 years ago, did not have access to images like we do today.
Yeah.
So what's going on with iconography worldwide with people who paint churches or paint panel icons? um, I have access to all of these other iconographers and all these different icons that in 10 lifetimes I wouldn't be able to view all those. So sometimes you get analysis paralysis. You see too much, but we live in a unique time because we, as artists in general, but as iconographers specifically, we have access to this. And so you're starting to see this rapid explosion of beautiful, highly skilled, high quality, high level contemporary iconography that is very traditional, but also very contemporary. It's a very exciting time to be doing this because of that. And it's also, I find it semi-poetic that I learned iconography in a very American way, very bootstraps way. And most iconographers I know, regardless of if you're painting walls or you're painting panels, learn iconography in that very American bootstrap way because we don't have that apprentice whatever path that you would have in another Orthodox country like Russia or Serbia. You don't go to a workshop and apprentice under somebody like a trade or whatever. Not everyone does that, but there's a lot of that. There's a lot of formal schools and stuff because it's such a part of their culture. But in America, it's like you just want to do it, cool. And there's good and bad with that, but at the same time, depends on what God does with Orthodoxy in America. But
Yeah.
we are developing. Hindsight's 2020. You don't see it when it's happening, but America, if the church blossoms here, which I'm assuming it will, hopefully God willing, is going to develop its own tradition. It already has. The people doing it, it can't not develop its own American Orthodox iconographic
Yeah, I mean,
tradition.
I for one am excited to see, just out of my own curiosity, the success of St. Ticon's. They've opened up their
Yeah.
iconography studio slash school, and their application process. It is very open ended. You don't have to be an iconographer to attend and sign up for your male the residency there at the seminary, and females have their own obligations for residence and room and board. But I mean, just to see that as an exciting thing to happen. And I guess that leaves me with my like three final questions since everything's kind of
Mm-hmm.
in freeze. Um, you had mentioned, earlier sort of copies or you look at others and you try it yourself. Is there a particular icon or is there a particular school or style that you have grown fond for in copying or emulating, or is there just one that sticks out to you that you've enjoyed the most out of sort of trying to replicate yourself?
Yeah, the Sinai Pantocrator is my Pantocrator, however you want to pronounce it, is probably the one that I painted it a lot, but it's the one that, interestingly enough, it's drawn from, it's pre-iconoclasm, so it's originally done in wax and caustic. When we were talking about mediums, I just barely brushed the top. I didn't even talk about wax and caustic, but wax and caustic is a medium that is literally hot wax, and there's some other things added, and pigment. That's the wax is the glue, and the pigment is the dirt or whatever. And so that icon specifically, it's probably, I would say, the most one of, if not the most beloved icon of Christ in the Orthodox Church. It's gorgeous. It's a very mysterious looking icon too, more so than any of the other ones, in my opinion, because it's after iconoclasm, after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, there was now this is conjecture because we don't have this written down, but if you look at what happened with the development of iconography, historically speaking, there was definitely a departure from much of the remaining realism that you had before. If you look at the Sinai icons that we have from before I think it's from the 6th century or whatever, when those were painted. And we don't have a lot of surviving examples because a lot of the iconoclasts destroyed them. But and a lot of the iconographers went west too, because there was no problem in Rome. So a lot of these guys went over there, and we don't know. There's no written record, so there's all this conjecture about all this stuff. But anyway, after the Seventh Ecumenical Council, there was a shift towards a more abstract's the wrong word. More, I guess you could say, what you would consider an iconographic, expressive, non-realistic departure. That was sort of jettisoned. Any remaining bit of the realism was sort of moved away from it. I don't know if that was because of iconoclasm. They wanted to like really separate from trying to depict anything other than what is transfigured, a totally different realm, and really visually tie into what the pronouncements of the Seventh Ecumenical Council said. I don't know if I think a lot of that's ivory tower conjecture, but you could make a case that that's where the Holy Spirit led the tradition. You could, and that would be a totally acceptable thing to say and believe. And I know a lot of people say and believe that. I tend to agree. Anyway, I am drawn to the Sinai icon of Christ, and it's called that, by the way, for those that don't know. You can Google it. Sinai, Sinai, Pantocrator or Pantocrator, however you want to pronounce it. Pantacrator. Yeah. And I spelled it out for you, not to be a nerd, but specifically for you to look this up, because when you look at this icon, if you haven't seen it before, most people have seen this icon. It is a very striking icon, and it's a very unique style too. And it's connected to the famed mummy portraits, and there's a whole history there as well. But the thing, and I have it hanging up right there, I won't pull it down, but part of the reason I like painting it so much, and I've painted tons and tons of versions of it. Yeah, there you go. See, Johnny on the spot. There you go. That's it right there. I've painted a lot of versions of that because, number one, it's challenging to paint and get right, because it's a portrait. Basically, you're painting a portrait. That's a totally different approach than any other style of iconography, or I guess a more Cretan or Byzantine style of iconography. It's a very different approach because of the way it's painted. It's almost done like you would do a modern oil painting. It's the wax is used almost in a it's almost sculpted where the highlights are. It's a very interesting technique. But the other reason is that the way that just the expressiveness of the face, it's just one of my favorite icons. And it is beloved within the church because of everything I just said. It profoundly impacts people who see it, and it's to many, many people. And I just personally love painting it because it's such a challenge. It's one of the only icons that you have to nail. You have to get it exact and perfect, or else it doesn't have what makes it so special. And it's a challenge to do that every single time. I've done it. I can't even count how many times I've painted it. If you go on my, I guess you can go on my website, or my Instagram is where I have most of my most recent stuff. So if you go on there and find me on there, you can see all the different versions of it that I've painted. But that's probably the icon that I like to paint. One of the icons I like to paint the most, even though that's not really the style that I just paint in all the time. I sort of have a mishmash of different styles. I just kind of have my own thing going on. I guess that sounds really self-indulgent, but not intentionally. it just sort of developed the way it did. So, but yeah, I would say that that's probably the icon that's had the most
Okay.
impact on me as an artist.
Well, there you go. Second question would then be, out of all of the work that you've done, I know this is, I'm going to phrase this incredibly carefully because this is not to invoke pride.
Right.
But if there was, out of all of your work, if there was one to say that, that there is a, because every artist does take pride in their work. Like we were just talking about this, about
Hmm.
self-worth and everything.
You have to,
But
yeah.
not to cross that bridge of blowing smoke up someone's rear end. But I
Yeah.
mean, if there was one that you would say, like, this is the one I would show people to say, this is my work, this is who I am, what would that icon be?
Um, Probably one of those Sinai Pantocrators. I would probably, there's a couple of them, but there's a few like that of Christ. There's a recent one that's not the Sinai, but there's a Mandylion that is an interesting palette that I recently did, which wasn't, or I do these iconographic portrait icons of Saint Paisios that people buy all the time, people love, something like that. I made an effort to not totally separate myself from my oil painting, from my my love of painting portraits. I've tried to bring as much of that as I can into iconography. You don't want to necessarily depict a hyper realistic portrait, even though I will. I'm not against that. People request that all the time, and
Hmm.
I will do that. When people want me to do that, I'll do that. I've done a few Father Seraphim Rose like that. Some people have this big problem with it, and I respect them, and they have like theological reasons, which is based in some of this iconology that Ouspensky's iconology and stuff that he received in Russia from there's a whole lineage there, and it's valid. So I get it. It's not the totality of the Orthodox teaching on iconography, though. So, like we were saying before, people misunderstand and they think that all of this stuff is dogmatic, and if you have a different opinion, well, then you're wrong, and that's not a real icon. It's like, well, no, that's not how this works. Like, and opinions and the understanding of this has changed a lot. And a lot of the things that you repeat to me about iconography are actually from the 20th century. It didn't exist. Nobody said that before this guy, who I won't say. But
Yeah.
there is a source for this stuff. It didn't just come out of nowhere. It wasn't just like God didn't come down and say everything needs to look like this Byzantine aesthetic is revealed. It's like, no, that has a history separate from Christianity, and it developed. A lot of the garb that you see the saints wear, or like on an icon of Christ. I mean that there's like a secular Roman imperial connection there with some of that stuff. It's not like it's totally foreign and this was a totally new thing. Like that's when I said earlier about it. It's also art. There's an art history aspect to iconography too. It's actually much deeper than a lot of Western art, because there's a connection with religion, more so than in the West, in my opinion, and that religion is the foundation of a civilization. So obviously, there's immense symbolic importance with a lot of the stuff that's depicted in our iconography, and so you're going to have those meanings outside of what does this person in 1930 who wrote this book about it think that this means now. And that's how a lot of our iconology, which is I'll explain this in a way that's not too jargon filled, but iconology, it's the theological and the symbology of Orthodox iconography, basically. I'm sure there's a better definition, but that's a basic understanding of what iconology is. And so a lot of it, though, has been, you have these artifacts, these things that develop within the art of iconography, and then you have this theology that's overlaid on top of it after the fact. Not always, but most of the time. A good example, and I use this example a lot, is when people say write or paint an icon. And both are fine, but right when someone says, you're supposed to say write, not paint. It's like, well, that's actually a goofy a misunderstanding of the translation of the word paint, and somebody just happened to think that there was this, this theological truth about iconography as a language, and it's the gospel in paint, and we're writing because the word of God, there's all these extrapolations about why that this works with Orthodox theology, and it actually does. So it's totally cool, you can say that, that's fine, but it's something that originated in the West in contemporary times. Like, nobody was running around in 1450 saying, I write icons. Like, nobody was saying that. It was
Mhm.
paint. And so, but there's nothing wrong with saying it. It becomes wrong when you browbeat me and say that I'm wrong for saying paint. Then that's wrong because you've weaponized something to make yourself look smart, and then what's the point? But
Yeah.
if you want to use it, but if you want to use this mistranslation that somebody pulled some very interesting kind of neat theology out of, if you want to use that because you like how it sounds, and it sounds more, it separates iconography from art for you, go for it. If you use it to teach people what the language of iconography is, absolutely. And a lot of our iconology, that's how that happened. It's like I said, it's an imperfect example, but a lot of that stuff, that's how that happened. We don't have, not everything is spelled out like in the Seventh Ecumenical Council. There's no big tome of like every Orthodox iconographer has this giant book of canons, and we have to follow them to the letter. That's not really how it develops, or that's not really how it works. There is some of that, but it's not so easily defined or boiled down to just these bullet points of do's and don'ts.
Mm. And then my last question for you would then be, we sort of touched on it when we were talking about sort of the tradition or what might come out of America, but both just in the Orthodox world, but also here in America, where do you see the future, or where do you see like the hot place to be? I know that I did some of my homework because because also I had shown my own teacher this, because a while ago you talked about Romania sort of being like the place
Oh
to
yeah,
be for its style, and some of those icons that they have, especially if they're newly canonized saints,
yeah.
are just beautiful in their own right, unlike any others I've seen, either in Russia or here in America. So where is that the place to sort of look where that tradition would be? I mean, you've mentioned um, Art Mandrite Xenon. Like, is that going to be, are these things sort of where we should be looking at, where the future of this sort of tradition, and progressive in the sense of the word, within our
Right,
in our own traditional boundaries?
right. I mean, yeah, and honestly, this could all just be my personal preference. One of the reasons I enjoy, and now I don't do iconography this way. I don't. This isn't my approach or my style. But Romania is an interesting place regarding iconography because they're doing something very contemporary, but also it's very, well, everywhere is doing something contemporary and traditional because that's, you can't not. But I guess the aesthetic that I like is coming out of Romania, even though I don't paint that way. I think maybe I like it so much because that's not the style in which I paint. I could, but it doesn't feel natural because that's just not, when you've been painting iconography so long, and you just like anything, you kind of settle into a way of doing things, and you depart and you add things here and there, and it develops in my own life as far as how I go about doing things. But I think I really like it because it's still, to me, it's still all these other styles and cultural expressions are, for lack of a better term, they're demystified to me because I've dissected them all, just purely from as a for educational purposes for myself. But in Romania, there's just something about it. I can't really put my finger on it. It has this very ethereal, interesting embrace of like really high quality Cretan style iconography. That the dark proplasmos and the very yellow um, skin tone. I really like that. It's not my thing, but it's something I really like. And there's also a lot of iconographers there who have embraced bringing in more realism in a very iconographic way. And I really like that. But as far as your broader question, I think that's sort of unanswerable. Not that it's a bad question, but it's unanswerable because definitively because it's all happening at once.
Yeah.
So it's like, yeah, Archimandrite Xenon is doing his thing, and when he reposes, he'll have a whole line of students that'll just kind of keep going, and then you have in Russia there is an explosion. You know, there's there's churches being built, this insane amount of churches, but there's also this. Most Americans have no idea. There's this massive Renaissance rediscovery explosion in iconography in all schools, all styles in Russia. In Russia, in my opinion, Russia has the best artists in the world are from Russia and Ukraine, hands down. The best painters, any style, whether it's Western, academic art, non-iconographic art, contemporary portraiture, whatever you want to call it, the best art in the world is being done in Russia. There's a lot of amazing Western style portrait painters coming out of China too. Imagine that. But Russia, you know, I mean, they have the Repin school there, you know, so like, not just that, like there's such an influence of Western theology and Western art. And then you had communism sort of insulated Russia from a lot of bad ideas and a lot of the modern art nonsense, the philosophy that pushed modern art, the destructive, demonic philosophy. I think modern art is not just a degradation, but I think it's a rebellion against God. That's a whole other conversation, but just in general. But you know, this is not like big brain. You know, this is like kind of midwit art takes, but it's just true. I'm not trying to sound smart or like edgy or like I have some hot take. This is just, everybody knows this. Communism insulated Russia and all of those areas, mostly Orthodox countries, from the poison that made its way, the venom that made its way through the West. And it had its effect on their art and their iconography. And so once that fell away and they were able to kind of come out of the catacombs for real and there's more freedom there, yeah, I mean, it's exploded. It's that mixed with, you know, the communism is gone, their society is coming out of that, but also the explosion of Christianity, along with what we said earlier, the proliferation of images by the internet. It's like, you know, people are getting good at stuff really fast because of the internet. And so you have all of these things working together. And so in Russia, and they have things down, they've been Orthodox for 1,000 years. So they have these schools and these 100 different places to learn how to paint iconography at a high level, at a very high level. And so, and it's everywhere. Iconography is everywhere. High quality hand painted icons are everywhere. You can buy them everywhere. And so that's interesting there. It's happening all over the world. Greece, it's, you know, everywhere, every Orthodox country, but at the same time, it's sort of beginning to happen in America. I was interested in like helping that along, but again, I don't really have the expertise. And I feel like that's like a really, you know, like that just is like, you don't want to do something like that. Like, well, I'm going to try and, you know, if that happens, if I can help someone here and there, cool. But I don't want to be like some, you know, figurehead teacher thing. Like I do a workshop here and there, but like, I'm not really looking to create that or do anything like that, because that's just a cringy thing to, you know what I mean? That's like, it's like if you're like, I'm going to write poetry and I'm going to become a really influential poet. Like if that's what you're doing, then it's not going to happen. You just sound like an idiot.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
If God blesses you and that happens, cool. But I don't have the patience for it. And I'm more interested in painting. And so, but yeah, if I can help somebody or, you know, somebody emails me and I get around to emailing them back. That's what I tell all of them. Like, you don't need a guru. You don't need someone to like be your master like you're a Jedi. You just paint. Ask
Yeah.
questions. I'll tell you what I know. Email that guy or take a workshop. Put it all together and then just invest the time and pray about it. See where God takes you. It's
Yeah,
simple as that.
absolutely. Yeah, I mean the big reason why I sort of just asked is because I think I think what the future holds and what excites me is that we're now in a time where we have photo, video, and audio
Hmm.
recording of the saints of our day, and so I'm excited to see how that the iconographic tradition evolves in the age of digital photographs and 4K, 8K, HD recordings of
Yeah.
things. Like for instance, I have a print behind me of Archbishop Dimitri of Dallas, and it is done in
Yeah.
a very older, style that, despite the fact that we have video of him giving his homilies and things like that, so it's very and it captures him perfectly, I think, especially in his eyes. And it's just always interesting to see how that blend of portraiture, photograph, but also sort of the what people presume to be an icon. That's something for me I get excited about because we have video of Saint Paisios on the Holy Mountain. We have all this video of all the other of Saint Sophrony and the rest, and the icons that depict them are they I think they fit the tradition very well. So to me, that's just is an exciting thing to look at in the world as the church continues to live on.
Yep.
Yeah.
I agree.
Well, Mr. Swenson, where can people find your work, and what are you currently up to?
Um, yeah, I mean, if you just Google my name, Shayne Swenson or Shayne Swenson Icons, my website's just my name, ShayneSwenson.com. I haven't updated it in a while, but I post on Instagram semi regularly, like most artists. If you just Shayne Swenson Icons on Instagram, Twitter or X or whatever, and I still maintain a Facebook presence just because there's a lot of boomer priests that I just do business with on there, and they're on there. So I'm on Facebook. All of those spots. That's pretty much where I'm at. But YouTube, I've occasionally done some instructional videos, but as you know, making YouTube content is like really time consuming, and I don't have time to make the instructional videos that I'd like to. So I've made
Yeah,
like one or two, and it's just such a time sink. I just don't have time with all my other stuff. But I'm up to just painting and working on these big church projects. Hopefully, that should last me probably the next year, and then I don't know. We'll see where God takes it. Hopefully, I can connect with another parish and paint their church, but panel icons too. And I think I'm going to do a couple workshops this next year too, mostly on the East Coast. So yeah, follow me on social media and you'll find out when.
well, I'll have your links down below in the description. Shane, thank you so much
Cool.
for taking the time out of your busy schedule to chat with me, and may God be with you in your endeavors.
Same, man. Thanks for having me.
Anytime.